Few men have achieved cultural immortality quite like George Washington. He is perhaps the most famous American to ever live. But long before he was the revered revolutionary general or the statesman that shaped the office of president, he was an overly eager colonel in the Virginia militia who was reviled across the continent for setting off the 7 Years' War. Exactly 22 years before the colonies declared their independence from Britain, Washington spent his 4th of July surrendering in disgrace to a French army. And in doing so, he admitted to killing a French diplomat in violation of international law, sparking a conflict that would claim over 1 million lives across 4 continents and 2 oceans. Join us as we retrace young Washington's steps across Appalachia and discover how this young man's gambit led to World War Zero. Stay tuned. In order to understand the world that Washington was born into, we really need to start at the very beginning. Well, the earliest years of the English Empire. In 1606, King James I of England chartered 2 royal companies to colonize North America. The London Company was responsible for developing plantations in the south, and the Plymouth Company was responsible for settling towns and cities up north, which was eventually reorganized into New England. This Plymouth Company was made infamous by the arrival of the Mayflower in 1620. But a full calendar year earlier, an English privateering vessel carrying a very different sort of passenger arrived at its sister colony in the south and set what would become Virginia along a very, very different path. This ship was carrying 20 Angolan captives to be sold as indentured servants to the plantation owners of Virginia. After the whole colony in Virginia almost died after a really rough winter, the economic prospect of a constant supply of free labor overwhelmed the Virginian Christian sensibilities. And in 1662, Virginia established that any person born a slave could never be free, and neither, for that matter, could their children. In 1705, Virginia passed further draconian slave codes, cementing a brutal system of white supremacy in the southern colonies. By 1750, that number of 20 indentured and enslaved Africans rose to 100,000 people in Virginia that were living as slaves. And George Washington's birth coincided with this rising tide of American plantation slavery. He himself inherited a plantation and slaves at a very young age. George was a 4th-generation British American, a claim that very few could make, and he came from a very distinguished family. His older brother, Lawrence, was commissioned in the Royal Navy, and their father owned extensive plantation properties. After Lawrence's service to the British Crown, he established a plantation on the banks of the Potomac River, on the low-lying tidal estuaries of the Chesapeake Bay. Then, he promptly died of tuberculosis, leaving little George nothing but his land and his legacy to protect. In his final years, Lawrence had invested in the Ohio Company, which was a land speculation firm possessing a royal grant for 500,000 acres in the Ohio River Valley, on the opposite side of the Appalachian Mountains from English settlements. When Lawrence died, he passed his shares of the Ohio Company on to his younger brother. So, to advance and honor his family legacy, George would have to navigate the political currents of westward English expansion. The opportunity to do this would arise in the fall of 1753, when then Virginian Governor Robert Dinwiddie, himself a part owner of the Ohio Company, called upon George to help stake their claim out west.
You see, Virginia had a problem. The past 100 years of tobacco cultivation had completely depleted the topsoil, and the planter class was worried that they had extracted all the profit that they could out of their properties. And it was crucial to their own economic survival that they expand the plantation system westward. Luckily, the original charter for Virginia gave them license to do just that. Their southern border went straight across the continent, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and included, quote, the island of California. Suffice it to say, the government at the colonial capital of Williamsburg understood very little about the immense claims within their territory.
In the 1700s, Britain and France both claimed enormous territories in North America. From their distant palaces in London and Versailles, King George and King Louis nursed their grievances towards each other and consulted their conflicting maps to try to figure out what land belonged to whom. The orders they sent their colonial governors were based on an imperfect understanding of geography and the imperial periphery. It was a recipe for disaster. With the frontier still anybody's game, the young and ambitious Washington was given a mission by Governor Dinwiddie himself.
Washington's assignment was simple: to deliver a letter to the French commander at Fort Le Boeuf, which was part of a chain of forts stretching up the Great Lakes through Niagara Falls to Canada. The letter, written by Governor Dinwiddie, simply asked the French to leave. During his travels, Washington was also to make a detailed record of the natural landscape west of the Appalachian Mountains, as well as French military installations and indigenous political powers in the region, just in case Britain and France crossed sabers once more.
On the morning of All Hallows' Eve, October 31st, 1753, Washington departed from Williamsburg with a companion, a Dutch mercenary called Jacob van Bram. He was an old family friend who actually taught George how to fence back in the day. And this is the letter that they carried with them.
Sir, the lands upon the River Ohio in the western parts of the colony of Virginia are so notoriously known to be the property of the Crown of Great Britain that it is a matter of equal concern and surprise to me to hear that a body of French forces are erecting fortresses and making settlements upon that river, within His Majesty's dominions.
It took Washington and Van Bram just 14 days to reach the edge of their world. In what is now the city of Cumberland, Maryland, there was only a cabin belonging to a fur trader named Christopher Gist. It lay just a few miles from the Eastern Continental Divide, the point beyond which all water flowed west into the Mississippi Valley and eventually the Gulf of Mexico. That made this one of the most remote British settlements in the entire area. Every step beyond Gist's cabin took the party farther outside the pale of British settlement and into the contested Appalachian Mountains. They did not know when they would first encounter the French, and if they did, who would shoot first.
Britain and France operated two very different kinds of empires in North America. French settlement was concentrated up in Canada around the St. Lawrence River, and down in Louisiana around the Mississippi River. Between the two, across thousands of miles of flat plains and rivers, the French maintained a series of forts where they traded guns for furs which were hunted by indigenous locals. France depended heavily on strong native alliances to project their power and influence into an area which had very few actual French settlers. And in doing this, the Canadian Governor-General adopted the Algonquin honorific Onontio, which imparted onto them the cultural role of a father of the land, one who mediates disputes, provides gifts, and exerts a persuasive power rather than a brutal, violent authority. British colonialism, on the other hand, was a completely different beast, a much larger, bigger beast. Compared to the 70,000 French inhabitants of North America, the British colonies boasted over 1 million loyal subjects, and they lived in large cities surrounded by towns and plantations. It wasn't a series of remote military outposts like the French. It was an extension of Britain herself, the fate of whose inhabitants were as tied to the mother country as her imperial whims and ambitions were tied directly to them. The British scorned native alliances. Their ultimate goal was the dispossession of all natives and the manifestation of an English-speaking civilization from sea to shining sea, as had been promised by the British Crown.
But that destiny was being thwarted by the French, who, despite their inferior numbers, maintained a stubbornly resilient empire that prevented the British from expanding west of the Appalachians. So, on November 15th, Washington, Gist, and a party of frontiersmen ventured beyond King George's undoubted limits. They could not have known it at the time, but they were about to set in motion the events that would finally break the French Empire in America for good.
After a week of traveling through brutal rain and snow, Washington and his team arrived here, at Turtle Creek in Pennsylvania. It's a stream that empties out into the Monongahela River just a few miles from Pittsburgh. These days, the area is marked with the Edgar Thomson Works, which was built by Andrew Carnegie in 1873. But 120 years before that, this area was home to a completely different commercial venture, which was started by a completely different pioneering Scotsman. His name was John Fraser, and he was one of the earliest British traders this side of the Appalachian Mountains. As a general rule, traders from Britain weren't really welcome in these parts. It was very dangerous, very risky, but it could also be very profitable. And Fraser took the risky bet of building his trading post here after getting permission from the local Queen Aliquippa to do so. Washington needed a man like Fraser with his frontier connections in order to ingratiate himself with the local leadership and meet the native tribes. We're here in Pittsburgh's Point. I'm actually standing on a marker for the old shoreline of the rivers. This is one of the most culturally significant places in the whole county and really the whole region. It's the area where, after hundreds of meandering miles, the Monongahela and the Allegheny River join to form the Ohio. Whoever has control of this point of confluence controls all of the interior waterways, including the Mississippi and access to the Gulf of Mexico. It's such a strategically important spot that Washington himself even noted it in his journal. And if he wanted to get control of that part of the country, he would have to win diplomatic favor with the people that lived here. So Washington headed downriver to do just that. I'm standing in Baden, Pennsylvania, about 10 miles down the Ohio River from Pittsburgh. Right now, just kind of an empty lot, but if I had been here about 300 years earlier, I would have been in one of the densest, most diverse settlements this side of the Appalachian Mountains. It was called Logstown in English, but its residents came from all over. Since any military action in North America depended heavily on the cooperation and allegiance with the native tribes, it was imperative that the British develop their diplomacy in the area. About 1,000 years ago, this land was occupied by people called the Monongahela. Sometime prior to sustained European contact, the Monongahela died off from a combination of epidemics and drought. And as the British began pushing further east in their former lands, remaining refugee tribes like the Delaware and the Shawnee settled a little further west out here in the recently depopulated Allegheny Mountains. That placed them under the influence of the Iroquois Six Nations, perhaps the most powerful native authority on the entire continent. They called themselves the Haudenosaunee, and they were at first formed out of only 5 nations: the Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Oneida, the Seneca, and the Cayuga. They all spoke related languages and had a shared history of culture and warfare long before European contact. In fact, as early as maybe the 1100s, a prophet named Daganoweda delivered a divine revelation that he called the good news of peace and power. His message and the practices espoused united 5 of the nations under the leadership of the legendary chief Hiawatha, establishing a lasting peace amongst the nations.
By the early 1600s, the Haudenosaunee had gained access to European weapons thanks to Dutch traders in the Hudson Valley, giving them a technological edge over other tribes.
The Haudenosaunee had a representative in Logstown named Tenocrison, and if Washington wanted to get anywhere in the area, it was with him that he needed to meet. According to historian Fred Anderson, Tenocrison was born as a member of the Catawba Nation in South Carolina, where he was captured as a child and forced into the Seneca Nation. This practice of kidnapping and ritual adoption was one of the ways that the Iroquois kept their numbers from dwindling as more and more of them continued to die from European war and disease. Tenocrison's diplomatic tasks weren't easy. In addition to leading his own Mingo followers, Tenochrison had to manage diplomacy with the next-door tribes of the Delawares and the Shawnees, the Algonquin-speaking refugees that were forced out by English-speaking settlers in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And on top of that, Tenochrison had to fend off 2 European empires right at his doorstep, and handled their bumbling 21-year-old emissaries. In 1752, Tenochrison attended a council at Logstown, where representatives from the Ohio Company hammered out a treaty with the natives which they believed gave them the right to build a fort and a shop and a storehouse at the forks of the Ohio. The Delawares in Logstown felt alienated by Tenochrison's assent to the treaty, and conceded only on the condition that Tenochrison recognized one of their warriors named Shingus as their king. By recognizing Delaware sovereignty, Tenochrison could feel his very authority over the Ohio Valley slipping away. He was called the Half-King by the English because they assumed he possessed a viceroy's prerogative, like their own governors and generals did back east. But authority in the Six Nations didn't flow top-down from a king. It flowed bottom-up from the people, the consent of the governed creating the authority. If Tenochrison became unpopular, he had no mandate from heaven to cling on to. He would be done for. Tenochrison knew that the French had designs to take his land, but he wasn't powerful enough to stop that on his own. He believed only an alliance with the British could preserve his position of authority over the Ohio Valley. But it was also in his interest to keep the British and the French at odds. God forbid one of them vanquished the other, then Tenochrison and his men might suffer the fate of so many other Indians before them. But when Washington got to Logstown, however, Tenochrison had already left to go and meet with Jacques St-Pierre, the newly promoted commander up at Fort LeBoeuf. While Washington was anxiously awaiting his return, a few unexpected guests arrived, deserters from the French army who had fled the Illinois country, heading towards Philadelphia. When Washington asked about other French forts, the answer from the deserters was grim. They told him that there were numerous well-armed forts throughout the interior, all the way from Arkansas to Indiana. Worse still, these soldiers had been sent from Illinois to try to build a road between Fort LeBoeuf and Lake Erie, the type of military infrastructure that the British were still years away from engineering. The French were closing in on the forks of the Ohio from both sides, and it was only a matter of time before they showed up in full force. There could be no time to delay the race to control the confluence, but Washington had no choice but to wait. Tenochrison finally returned here to Logstown on November 26th, and that very night, Washington entered the council longhouse and asked them to escort him to Fort LeBoeuf. The sachems of Logstown patiently listened to the requests of this tired, weary, visibly distressed white boy, and then began to speak amongst themselves. All Washington could do was wait patiently in their smoke-filled room, awaiting a verdict. After some deliberation, Tenochrison decided that he would indeed accompany Washington on his mission to LeBoeuf. Fueled by a desire to curtail French incursion onto his land, he decided it was time to sever diplomatic ties with them, even going so far as to return the wampum belt that the French had given him. He would be their friend no longer. Upon hearing the news that he was hoping for, Washington eagerly asked if they could leave right away. But to his disappointment, he had to wait 4 agonizing days, and he was beginning to learn that patience was a virtue and a necessity when it came to these negotiations. On the last day of November, a full month after leaving Williamsburg, Washington left Logstown with Tenochrison, 2 Mingo warriors, and a hunter to go and deliver the bad news to the French at Fort LeBoeuf. Without anything remarkable happening but a continued series of bad weather, Washington and his party arrived here, at Venango, a Delaware village located where the French Creek meets the Allegheny River. It was here that a French officer named Philippe Joncaire had taken over a complex of storehouses and workshops established by none other than John Fraser, who had been evicted from his trading post back in August by the new French governor Marquis Duquesne, the stern new governor of Canada, who decided that there would be no more British traders in King Louis's land. Joncaire graciously invited the beleaguered travelers for supper, and as the party began to drink, Washington recorded what the loose-lipped soldiers had told him. He wrote, quote, "The wine, as they dosed themselves pretty plentifully with it, soon banished the restraint which at first appeared in their conversation, and gave license to their tongues to reveal their sentiments more freely. They told me that it was their absolute design to take possession of the Ohio, and by God they would do it. For that, although they were sensible, the English could raise 2 men for their 1. Yet they knew their motions were too slow and dilatory to prevent any undertaking of theirs." The rain continued to fall in sheets outside. Tenocrison offered the wampum belt to Joncaire, but he refused, claiming that it wasn't his to receive, but rather they should take it upriver to his superior at Fort Le Boeuf. While the French commander plied Tenocrison with gifts and promises, Washington became ever more anxious to leave. Finally, on December 7th, 4 Frenchmen joined Washington and Tenocrison to be their honor guard on this final leg of the journey. Fort Le Boeuf no longer exists, but in 1753, this would have been a sight to behold in the middle of these glacial lowlands. Washington himself estimated there to be over 100 soldiers living here, plus their officers. It was a 4-pointed star fort, just exactly the kind that the French had become so expert in crafting in all of their European wars. Each bastion of the fort had 2 cannons, and the complex was surrounded by a high palisade wall. It had all of the amenities of a European castle: stables, a blacksmith's, a shop, a doctor's office, and of course, a Catholic chapel. And the creek was busy with 220 canoes, an Allegheny armada. Washington makes little note in his journey about what exactly St. Pierre told him when he read Dinwiddie's letter. We can only imagine their dynamic. St. Pierre was 30 years Washington's senior, a veteran who had been fighting in New France's frontier wars for longer than Washington had even been alive. And he had no intention of vacating his land at the impossibly audacious request of the Virginians shivering before him. Washington asked St. Pierre why he had taken captive 2 traders in the Ohio Valley. Quote, "He told me the country belonged to them, that no Englishman had the right to trade upon those waters, and that he had orders to make every person prisoner who attempted it on the Ohio, or the waters of it." Even before Tenocrison could return his wampum belt, Washington got his answer. The French were not leaving, and they were not afraid of the British. This dispute would not end peacefully, and it was now Washington's mission to bring St. Pierre's reply back, and in one piece. But the journey back was much deadlier. It snowed, rained, and refroze in a bitter cycle that sapped the energy out of the warm-blooded Virginian. Ironically, this brutal winter was the only thing preventing the French from taking the forks of the Ohio.
The Virginians had the geographic advantage of approaching from the Monongahela River, which took a more southerly course and had warmer waters. The French, on the other hand, were locked in place for the season on the icy Allegheny waters. Sometime after Christmas of 1753, somewhere in the vast snowy hill country of the Allegheny Valley, somebody tried to shoot Washington. Him and Gist can't exactly agree on what happened or who did it or why, but they never mention the incident again.
Just a few days later, Washington would cheat death once more. When they reached the Allegheny River on December 29th, they built a raft and attempted to make it across. Washington says they were in only 10 feet of water when a fast-moving piece of ice struck his pole and jerked him into the water. Gist once again leapt to the rescue of his bumbling master, pulling him out of the water and getting a nasty case of frostbite in the process. They spent the night here on an island now called Washington's Landing. Just upriver is a bridge called Washington's Crossing, which connects to Pittsburgh's 40th Street in the neighborhood of Lawrenceville. But the historical Washington didn't have access to a big steel high-level bridge. But luckily, the cold weather, which had so recently attempted to take their lives, graciously froze the Allegheny River solid. And when the sun rose, our exhausted duo shuffled back to Turtle Creek to warm their hands at Fraser's cabin. When Washington got there, he learned that the local Queen Aliquippa was very upset that he had just passed her by on his way to Logstown. Her village, which contained people of the Seneca Nation, was located in what is now McKeesport. Washington apologized for his transgression, which he soothed with a winter coat and a bottle of rum gifted to the Queen.
After a headlong sprint from the forks of the Ohio all the way back to Williamsburg, Washington finally handed St. Pierre's reply to Governor Dinwiddie. After reading the French commander's reply, Dinwiddie was convinced that he held the casus belli for a new war with France, the very thing that he was hoping for.
Immediately, Dinwiddie gave militia commissions to the Ohio Company agents that were already out in the field, essentially making a private militia out of his corporation. They ordered Washington to raise 200 soldiers for a campaign at the Forks, and he sent a request for military aid to all other colonial governors in North America. Then, on February 14th, after taking the necessary steps to plan a war, Dinwiddie convened the legislature into a session. Virginia's lower assembly, called the House of Burgesses, was already furious with Dinwiddie over his taxation policy, so they were incensed to hear that he had just started a war without their consent. But, like good colonial patriots when backed into a corner, they quietly agreed to appropriate all the necessary funds for the effort and for the bellicose whims of their chief executive.
One of the Ohio Company agents in the field, the newly promoted Captain William Trent, received special orders from Dinwiddie to begin construction of a storehouse at the Forks as soon as possible. Thus, the first British incursion west of the Appalachian Mountains would not be a military outpost, but it would belong to a private company, the Ohio Company. When Captain Trent arrived at the Forks in February, Tenockerson was all too relieved to see the British finally make good on their promise, and he even laid the first log of the new storehouse himself. They knew that the only thing keeping the French in place was the cold weather, an advantage that was certainly going to melt away in the coming months. While Governor Dinwiddie and the House of Burgesses haggled in Williamsburg over the details of this new military campaign they had just set off, Washington traveled up the Potomac River to meet his recruits. They were 160 people that Washington described as, quote, loose, idle persons that are quite destitute of house and home, and may I truly say, many of them of clothes. But this was about as good as he could hope for. So, on April 2nd, he mustered his army and marched once again into Appalachia.
About 2 weeks into the journey, while toiling up the rugged Appalachian Mountains, Washington received devastating news from the Forks. Captain Trent had lost control of the confluence. It was on April 17th, the very day that the English had finished the fort, that an army of 500 French troops carrying 18 cannons landed on the riverbank, and Trent, lacking anything he would need for a fight, abandoned his puny storehouse and fled. Well, the news was a blow to Washington's campaign. It was the absolute end of the world for Tenockerson. With French control established at the Forks, he had really lost all legitimacy over the Ohio Indians, and his entire following would now consist of merely 80 people, mostly kin and close companions, willing to follow him to the bitter end.
Washington's army made it all the way to here, Redstone Creek, which was a tributary of the Monongahela that the Ohio Company had built a storehouse at. But when Washington got there, he assessed the strength of his army and decided that it would be wiser if they retreated back into the Appalachian Mountains.
This meadow, tucked into the Laurel Highlands, is where Washington decided to stop. Never mind the fact that it was the lowest point around and prone to flooding, or that it had ample trees that gave easy cover to an enemy. A more experienced commander would have chosen differently, but then again, a more experienced commander might not have gotten himself into this situation to begin with. On May 27th, a frantic Christopher Gist arrived to the Great Meadow. His scouts had warned of French soldiers headed towards Washington's position. Washington, short on patience but long on pride, acted immediately. He sent 75 men southwest to intercept the French, but just hours later a new message arrived from Tenocrasin. The French were coming, and from the opposite direction, the northwest. Leaving behind only a skeleton crew at the meadow, Washington took 47 men to go and head towards Tenocrasin's camp. The summer of 1754 was heavy and humid in Appalachia. The moon and the stars were blotted out by immense rain clouds, and the blind Washington led his even blinder men from hill to hill for hours on end. Finally, the sun rose and the clouds cleared, and they reached Tenocrasin's camp, where the Half-King was utterly relieved to finally see Englishmen in uniform. He joined up with several of his own Mingo warriors, and they headed out almost immediately. Washington still had no idea what the French soldiers were up to, and the rules of engagement in the forest were pretty unclear. Every authority from the crown going down had passed on vague instructions to their inferiors, increasing confusion and ratcheting up the tensions to 11. But it was too late now for doubt. They had marched for so long, and their momentum was, at this point, unstoppable. After a short walk, the group arrived here. It's a pleasant, protected place to sleep that Tenocrasin knew quite well. However, down in the hollow, 35 Frenchmen were lacing up their boots with bleary eyes. Silently, with few hushed words, Tenocrasin ordered his men to go and try to block the exit. The Virginian ordered his men to raise and level their muskets. And then, a shot rang out. Washington wrote, quote, "We were pretty advanced near to them, as we thought, when they discovered us, whereupon I ordered my company to fire. We killed Mr. de Jumonville, the commander of that party, and also 9 others. We wounded 1. This account is very dubious. For one, his numbers don't make any sense. That Washington's army of untrained volunteers with smoothbore muskets could have killed 10 and wounded 1 in their very first skirmish is almost unbelievable. But luckily, this isn't our only account of the incident. As soon as the shooting started, a lone Canadian by the name of Monceau was outside of the glen for reasons that we can only speculate. His account contradicts Washington's by one very crucial detail. After watching the British unleash 2 devastating volleys, Monceau heard Jumonville's voice begging the British to cease fire. When the shooting stopped, he hightailed it back to Fort Duquesne. So if Jumonville survived the shooting and surrendered, then how did he die? The most comprehensive account comes from an Irish soldier called John Shaw. His story comes from several other witnesses, and it goes something like this. After the British ceased fire, Tenocrasin himself walked up to Jumonville and said something in French. Since Shaw and his witnesses didn't speak French, Shaw surmised that the Half-King had asked Jumonville if he were an Englishman. When he answered no, Tenocrasin raised his hatchet and sunk it into Jumonville's head, splitting his brains in 2 and allegedly washing his hands with them. Well, there's one last account. A month after the skirmish, a man named Denis Caninguen arrived at Fort Duquesne. His name suggests that he was likely a Catholic Haudenosaunee, one of Tenocrasin's men, and unlike Shaw, he did actually speak French. And according to his account, Tenocrasin didn't ask Jumonville if he was an Englishman. Of course, he knew that he wasn't. Caninguen instead recounts the words uttered by the Half-King as being something far darker and a little more personal. Tu n'es pas encore mort, mon père. Thou art not dead yet, my father. By invoking the fatherly authority that had been given to the French Empire, he was signaling the end of his obedience to French interests. He was done.
By now, the French were firmly entrenched at the forks. and they had an open supply line stretching all the way back to Quebec. They could very easily detach several hundred soldiers to deal with this troublesome Virginian.
Anticipating a French response, Washington ordered the construction of a palisade wall to make their muddy camp something a little more resembling a classical European fort. A fort of necessity, he called it. Behind me is a recreation of that very fort, and yeah, it really was that shitty. Washington boasted in a letter to Governor Dinwiddie that it could withstand the assault of 500 men, but where he got this confidence remains unclear. Tenockerson dismissively called it that little thing upon the meadow, but despite his doubts, things were looking up for the Virginians. A couple weeks after the massacre, Washington received 200 more reinforcements from Virginia. And 3 days later, a company of British soldiers arrived from South Carolina, adding 100 redcoats and 40 head of cattle to the mission. The sight of His Majesty's highly trained beef-eating troops might have first brought relief to the undersupplied colonials, but it soon made everything a lot worse. Their commander, Captain Mackay, refused to take orders from Washington despite his nominally higher rank. To Mackay, the lowest British officer still ranked above the highest colonial.
By the middle of May, Washington's army encamped at Fort Necessity had become very formidable, but it was still a mess. It was a hodgepodge of colonial militiamen and imperial redcoats with an unclear chain of command and supply lines stretched to the breaking point. The French, on the other hand, were dug in at Fort Duquesne, which was perhaps the most formidable military installation south of Lake Erie and west of Philadelphia. They had more men, more supplies, and more experience. A commander with more patience than Washington maybe would have chosen to wait.
But Washington, of course, was not a patient general. So on June 16th, he decided to take the fight to the French. He would recapture the forks of the Ohio himself.
Washington's mission was doomed to fail. After 2 weeks of traveling just 2 to 3 miles per day, they only barely made it from Fort Necessity out of the Appalachian Mountains. They didn't even make it to the Monongahela River. Their pack animals had died in appalling numbers, their wagons broke down, and the men were forced to carry heavy siege guns up the mountains by hand. Washington's army rendezvoused once again with Christopher Gist and Tenockerson. Tenockerson decided to use his last ounce of diplomatic sway in the region to convince the other local leaders to give Washington an audience. Eventually, 40 local leaders showed up to hear Washington out. They were looking forward to seeing what the British had sent to recapture the forks from France, but when they saw the condition of Washington's army, they knew he had already lost. Moreover, Washington continued to alienate the local leaders. Tenockerson is quoted as having said that Washington talked to them like they were his slaves. The council was a complete disaster. The delegates left, and Tenockerson fled for his life. On June 28th, a scout came into camp, telling them that a French force had left Fort Duquesne. It had about 800 French soldiers and 400 native warriors, perhaps the largest army for 1,000 miles in any direction. Even Washington could be convinced that advancing to the forks was a mistake, and they retreated back to Fort Necessity.
On the first day of July, the men collapsed here in the meadow. They were too exhausted to continue any further. When Washington called roll, only 284 men remained fit for duty. This would be their last stand, and all that was left to do was wait. On the morning of July 3rd, they were discovered by the French, and at 11 a.m., shots rang out through this meadow. Washington and the redcoat captain marched their men out to try to meet the French. But the French made target practice out of them from the trees, and they fled back to the fort on foot. A steady storm of water and lead poured through the meadow for at least 8 hours that day. The trenches became flooded with water and the gunpowder became damp. And by the time the sun set, a third of the men fit for the mission had been wounded or killed in action. While Washington pondered his next move, his men made it for him. They went to the liquor supply, opened it up, and the dehydrated, hungry men immediately fell into drunken stupors. At sunset, the fire slowed and a voice called out from the woods in French. Voulez-vous parler? Washington sent Jacob Van Bram, the man who had accompanied him the entire journey, to go and parley with the French. He returned with their terms of surrender, which, given the situation, were surprisingly generous. Around a flickering candle, Van Bram tried his best to translate the smudged document into English. It said that if the British gave up just 2 prisoners, they could surrender with full honors. But Van Bram seemed to have missed, or simply didn't tell Washington, that by signing the document, Washington was also admitting responsibility for the murder of Jumonville. For the French commander, this was all he needed: justice for his brother and defeat of the English. Washington made his mark on the parchment, giving France their own casus belli for the upcoming war. He had admitted to the unlawful killing of a diplomat. Within weeks, the news traveled east to the ears of Williamsburg and Quebec, and a few months later to London and Paris. This would start a conflagration that would claim 1 million lives on 4 different continents and in 2 different oceans, effectively World War Zero. In North America, it would result in the British military campaigns that destroyed French authority on the continent, cementing themselves as the preeminent power over the Atlantic Ocean. All this begun by Washington's surrender, which happened on the 4th of July, 1754.